So yes, mahalo nui loa for that fantastic afternoon of very wide-ranging talks around archives, Indigenous archives, the technology that's behind them, all that good stuff. And so we want to throw this open right away to questions from the audience. So go for it.
Hello. Thank you so much for this really inspiring afternoon. I'm really looking forward to rethinking our next steps for our archive project, given the information that we heard today. I have a question that's just going to echo Suzanne's question from the morning roundtable, because I thought it was excellent and can be asked to all of you, which is, what is your dream tool or your dream sort of component of digital archives or an archive project that you would want to envision happening? Maybe, Camille, you're already creating it with the classification scheme, but I'm sure you all have thoughts on it. If you had limited possibilities, what would you want to see?
So I think when I worked for my own community, I wanted to go back and find, create or work with something, and I thought it might have already existed, but I'm not a techie, and I was quickly told that what I imagined was far into the future. And I'm hoping it's getting closer. It is kind of with GIS, because it's connecting land and knowledge and subject, like, working with proper terminology for our community, and also being able to embed video or other types of voice and that kind of thing into it. But it needs to be organized in a meaningful way, and there's still really not the technology that exists to keep on doing that. And the reason why I believe it needs to be in a special type of house in a database that's connected to the land, that's connected relationship-wise, but also has access protocols like Makutu does, which is amazing, and I think that many people are aware of that, which it has the access for community or for government or researchers. But I think that part of that is that we need it to be into technology that's migratable to new platforms, because what we saw even today is that knowledge is disappearing because we're not able to keep migrating it, but it's also not connected. So if you're looking at what Sherry showed with the spider language, all of a sudden it becomes disconnected from the rest of that knowledge, and if it's not portrayed in a holistic form, it loses part of its value and meaning, that some of us don't know those connecting pieces anymore, even within our own communities. And so part of that is to be able to do that. But apparently I've been told that the technology, I was told about 3 months ago, we had this huge conversation in our joint working group, that the technology still doesn't exist to do that. So I don't know, I think that's your cue.
So I can also dream up a perfect tool. Yeah, I think, oh yeah, okay, I will then shift it. So I would rather explain what we are researching on right now and what we are working towards right now. So we have organized this event with about linked data with some museum professionals and also people who are researching slave trade data, and also some indigenous knowledge as linked data last year, and together also with the Wikimedia people from the Wikimedia Foundation in Germany, who are creating this linked data system. And I think we want to push into that direction, which is a recording system that can also record ambiguities and how to say different data about the same thing that is maybe even contradictory, but it can exist in the same space. Still, there is, of course, this idea that is really embedded in every wiki software, that everything is just for everyone and everything's open, and whoever has the most time on their hands basically dictates what's happening there. So there need to be changes in that direction. And otherwise we are working to improve what the emulation framework can do, what the web recorder tool can do, and that's not perfection and everything, but it's good enough for me.
I don't know about a tool, but two things that I sort of wasn't able to accomplish. And one is that I'd really like to have a digital library that would create the experience of paging through these magazines and journals so that people could experience that virtually. That's somehow less cumbersome than a PDF. I mean, it's not a huge amount of stuff, but so however many Tawaos, there's Iron Bow, 4 Talking Sticks, Sibo Kimowin, which is more recent. I know that Black Flash sells digital downloads for $5 each, so I was thinking maybe I could talk to them about sort of making a special issue of articles, because you have the special editions, of which there have been 2, I think, but there's also where the cover has been an Indigenous artist, and where there's been like an interview and an article, and if there was some way of creating a kind of after-the-fact issue that we could access. So I think that I personally would just like to see all that stuff in one location, in one library format, that would provide something of the actual browsing experience that you get from a paper. I'm still, very keen on paper. The other thing that I would, say envision, and I don't know what tools I would need to do it, but when we look at the language of spiders, and when we look at the water and light faces, I think what would be important for people becoming familiar with those projects is to have the context, not just simply, the archived experience of the digital project, but to have something about who was involved in it. And so when you think of the 2 students who worked on it, basically, both of them have gone on to have, continue to have very vibrant and important careers, and it's possible to interview them. Like, I would love to get Becca, Steve in a room and say, so tell me about this project. So that when someone would, experience it and then could listen to people talking about it, could see if there was any sort of supplementary literature that came out around it. Similarly with Language of Spiders, it's the reverse, actually, that many of the people involved in that have passed away. And it's really about honoring their memory and their contributions. And so then it would be Mimi Alvina's daughter, who's now doing her master's in journalism, and Lynn Akus, who is no longer active in the arts, but is now chief of Sakame. But to get those people around to kind of provide some context, because a lot of the work in that project is deeply personal. The poetry is deeply personal, and so I think it would be important to let people know more about the contributors, because there's very little about the contributors on the piece. So if there's I want something that looks nice, that's user-friendly, but that also kind of creates that experience of an actual archive, because I still love stuff. And that there's some way that we could make something like that, but I don't know. Maybe smart people here do.
Next question. Here we go, Amanda.
Hi there, thank you so much. Is this on? No, isn't it? There we go. Hi. I wanted to ask a question about preservation and conservation. So recently I interviewed Cheryl Rondell about her work on Muskegon Iskwayu's piece, Speaking Language of Spiders, which we saw. And she mentioned that she actually did a really significant intervention on that piece in 2011, which Sherry mentioned. And that originally it was very linear and you sort of burrowed deeper and deeper into the piece, but when she restructured it, she made it much more cyclical. So it's that like looping concept map that we saw. And she did that because she felt that that was what the piece intended to do in the beginning. So my question is sort of looping back to what Dragan presented. He said that sometimes it's less about restoring objects and more about preserving environments. And so I wanted to ask,
whether you all think that there is room for shape-shifting and intervention within the archive. Is there room for art objects and digital art objects to evolve while they're being archived? If that makes sense.
Yes, I would say most definitely, and we have a few of these pieces in our holdings, basically, our collection or repertoire or whatever. And this has been one of the places where like NetOut rubs against classical archival practices, because a classic archival practice would take care of an object that has been given to the archive and then guarantee that it hasn't been changed since then when you get it back, or at least have a record of all the changes that happened. And especially if you have like web projects that can be collaboratively added to by anyone who knows the URL, basically, that is not possible. But you need to find a way to, and it's actually not that hard to do that, to let the object change while it's in the archive, and I don't know, do snapshots or things like that.
I guess this is sort of old school museology and heritage. I used to be on the Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation board, and also look at museums and where objects are stabilized. And one of the sort of protocols there is that the new, it needs to be clear what is new and what was old. And so now that when you were mentioning, I thought, I bet Joe's voice wasn't in there before, because he wasn't around then, right? And so I think that would be something that, like when I talked about my dream thing about what I would want, then what I would include is how it evolved and what was added in 2011. And I mean, I suppose in an ideal thing, I would want the original there, and then how it evolved. And then I guess the question would be, could it continue to evolve? I would sort of have it continue to evolve by having maybe responses to it, or conversations about it, that kind of thing. But that would be my approach.
So I think that it's really important to show the dynamic nature of knowledge, right? So more working with if it's tangible or intangible knowledge, but also to show how it evolved. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about in the joint working group is doing, Stacey Ellison-Cassan's very much into the Wikipedia and the Wiki movement, is doing a wiki base that holds all the different iterations so that we can actually do that within that. So that's actually really fascinating to be able to look at that, because I think that our knowledge, it really transcends time and space in a lot of ways, so we need to really be able to portray that. But I also think that there needs to be, and so we're not working with sacred knowledge. So if we were working with sacred knowledge, right, or ceremonial knowledge, then there's a difference there where we need to actually put access protocols onto that knowledge. So I think that that's where we can use things like, we can use linked data and Wikibase to be able to do a lot of that other work, but then there has to be kind of like a skin, which is what Makuto is, to be able to put those access protocols in. So most of the information that Indigenous people work with and Indigenous knowledge, we want to share it with other people. It's open to other people. But there is some that is sacred and that's private knowledge for families or owned by clans that wouldn't necessarily be shared. So I think that showing some of that, you may not be able to show the original, but you may be able to show the stuff that's been transformed that we now see. So, for example, I'm wearing one of my cousin Alano's Edzertz's design with the beaver, and I know this story because it's a tell-10 story. So I would have to see if I had permission to be able to tell. I know I have permission to tell it, but I wouldn't tell it in an open setting, the story. But you're not knowing the story by seeing this design. So this design would be open for anybody to see, but the story, you would have to actually come into the community because many of our knowledges are shared in a way just like our herbal knowledges. If you don't share them in the culturally appropriate way, it can actually hurt people rather than help people, right? So I think that there's that balance that we have to remember, that it depends on the knowledge for communities, and that's where we have to have those kind of access protocols. Would you agree?
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Next. Well, one of the things I was thinking about through the talks was this thing that you were calling, thinking about the sort of the environment, right? Because I think, in a way, that I think for me, that translates into, a line of thinking when we're talking with Indigenous folks who are trying to figure out how to kind of store knowledge and carry it on, is that environment is really important, right? And figuring out how to articulate that environment in enough of a way that that you are not just replicating the environment, which you can't do, but that can be carried forward and made legible, to people who are your peers right now, but also sort of 2 or 3 or 4 generations down. I'm interested in sort of thinking more about how we might go about capturing what we might consider to be, say, the appropriate cultural context or environment for these pieces of artwork. And I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas about that.
So with the position that Rhizome has, and with the type of art and the communities that we work with, we found out that capturing or collecting, let's say, operating systems and the software around them is carrying so much information, because all of this is designed and produced in certain ways where at that point in time everyone thought that's how you need to do it, and that is good and beautiful and practical and all of these things. And this alone is important to see if the art wants to integrate with that or wants to break out of it. But for the more social context, that becomes very complex and can be, this is, how to say, on a technical level, you can basically figure out these things, or that's also one of the competencies that we have. Otherwise, I believe that for example, how religious art is restored in Mexico, I find that very interesting, because, for example, the statue of Holy Maria or something that is coming from a 17th century chapel or so, is not restored to exactly how it used to be, but together with that community, because they want to use that as continuous worshiping. And I mean, the worshiping situation in Mexico is pretty complex. So this is done by conservators together with the communities for this object to provide a certain role in that community. And I thought that is a very good approach, which is something that we kind of have a little bit of a blind eye at Rhizome to, because we are kind of the community ourselves. So we are like the net art folks, and so we can.
So you have a shared set of cultural understandings about.
Exactly, yeah. And we are not necessarily in a position where we need to exactly formulate it precisely. And I also believe that this can be very difficult to do, because many things that when you are forced to describe them, this is true on a technical level as on the cultural level, you will miss oftenly the most important ones, because they're the most normal and the most unusual, and not unusual, so you don't describe them. And then later in time, that might be the most viable information. So this is very hard to do.
I think at some point I'm going to go back to working on this project where I want to somehow have something that's land-based but also digital, like embedding digital information in the landscape. And the purpose for that is that there's a piece of land and it's very storied and people don't live there anymore. They don't own it anymore. They were removed forcibly from it. And that's a common enough story in different places, you know, in Indigenous country. And I've tried to recognize it in a couple of ways. And one of the things that happened, I was just painting a mural, and one of the people I've been working with said, don't give clear instructions on how to get here. Because we don't want tourist buses coming. We don't want buses we don't want field trips from the schools. We don't want field trips from the university. We don't want people running around. Like, we want people on this land that know how to behave here. And so I'm like, okay, that's easy. So then we've been thinking about how to have different levels of access. And I was actually on a bus eavesdropping when I was in South Dakota, and there was 2 Dakota guys sitting behind, and they were talking about levels of knowledge, and they were talking about how, as a community, during the 30s and 40s, in a desire to share, and this, you know, spirit of generosity, the elders and ceremonialists had basically given away too much. So Lakota and Dakota people were, in retrospect, saying we gave away too much, because there's all these yahoos going around doing sweats and pseudo. I was like, I was trained by a pseudo. I mean, it's just everywhere. And so it had reached a kind of crisis level from their perspective. And what they had been having, apparently, as I overheard, they've been having meetings at one of the tribal colleges. And what they were trying to distinguish was knowledge we hold for ourselves. Knowledge we share with, and this is their words, knowledge we share with other Indians. And then knowledge that we would make accessible to the public. And so that's the kind of conversation that I've been sort of tentatively having, because it's like knowledge for the family, knowledge for the collective of families who lived in that area, knowledge that they would want to be taught about their community by members of their community, and then knowledge for the general public. And so it's like these degrees of access, because what is shared and how it's shared. Because it's like you take stuff out of context and it can really go wrong in a hurry. Because we, amongst ourselves, you know, we can tell these rank stories, right? Rank stories. Well, maybe that's only true for Métis people, but we have, we were just like talking about fights at dances when we were kids, and we were just killing ourselves laughing. We were just saying, yes, this is like who we are. It's who we are. It's part of who we are. Is this something we want taught in grade 8 Native Studies? Probably not, right? But is this something we like to talk about amongst ourselves? Because we celebrate our toughness. Right?
Yeah.
We celebrate our toughness and we celebrate our resilience. And you know, those kinds of contexts, you know, how certain things are read or understood, you know, it can easily go south. And I learned that the hard way by in a workshop setting. I told a story for the reason of telling this kind of story serves this particular purpose. And I found out a year later that that story, which was a personal story from my family, was actually being repeated as a funny party joke. And I felt horrible, because these are people that I love who had become this topic of white, look at the Indians are so funny. And so that was a really hard lesson for me. It's like, what do you let go? Where do you let it go? Where do we put these contexts around? And we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect our families. We have to protect our knowledge. And, you know, and it isn't just ceremonial knowledge. It's also our experiences.
Thanks. I have to agree with that, and I would have to say that I've had some of those same experiences, and sometimes as Indigenous people, there's a general understanding that surrounds the cultural landscape that we take for granted as Indigenous people, and we also love humor. And so often we'll tell self-effacing stories, which then can have that same effect. But I also think that there's information that we share with other Indigenous nations too, so there's another layer, and I think that those layers haven't really been defined as good as they could, and with each community it's going to be different. So in my community there would be clan knowledge that's Tuskegee knowledge, then there would be family knowledge that comes from the Quack family, then there would be knowledge that comes from our place within the land where my dad was born at Chesley, which is one of our oldest areas that we believe that we survived, we have evidence that we survived the last glaciation there. And it's been confirmed. So there's things that we will share with other people about our territory, but then there's things that we never share with other people about those places. But sometimes that word gets out, and we might not even share with we would share some of those things with the neighboring nation, but we may not share it with a researcher that comes from the university. So there's even those kind of layers that kind of come out. And so you really have to work with each community, and that's where I think that relationship comes in place, because each community that you're going to work with, if you're working with the people from here or with people from the East Coast or from the West Coast, it's going to be different because their protocols are different than they're going to be in another place. And so that's where that relationship comes into play, because there's so many different layers of knowledge. And the one thing that I was so I thought about, because I'm always about preservation and doing digitization and this and that, but one of the things that I have to think about with open access is that once you share that information, you can never take it back. You can never, ever take it back. So if you share anything, like when I was working with my community with some of the government negotiations, I would only share polygons. I wouldn't share specific information that actually had a GPS locator back to the community, because that wasn't appropriate. We would do circles or polygons so that it was a general area. And I remember people getting really mad at me for that. And I said, no, because then they'll take and they'll say this is a whole moose meadow. Well, we got a moose at this end, so here, we'll protect this little microphone. Well, guess what? That animal doesn't know that that's not protected over there, so then they're going to go over there and whatever. And remember, I come from a traditional lifestyle, so when I see moose, it's like I'm seeing meat on 4 legs. So for me, it's not about not shooting them. It's about the fact that we have family-owned spots where we do our harvesting, whether it's our berry patches. We don't tell other people where we have our good berries, you know. So there is information that we do want to keep quiet, that we don't want to share with other people. But once it's out there, and you can never get it back. And so remembering that, where people have been so generous, and that's a great example with the Lakota people, because they were very generous, and we see lots of people from that big tribe, the wannabes, trying to copy their information. And that, like, I mean, honestly, that's something that's really happened for them, and it's been dangerous. And we know that people have passed away from being in the sweat lodge and not doing it appropriately. So we have to remember that our knowledge is valuable, it's sacred, and how do we go about doing that? And the only way that we can create these cultural landscapes that portray those interconnected relationship and that interconnectedness is by working with the community and having it be localized, and in some ways maybe it can get to the place where we include it, but that's where we can use information like linked data and like Wikibase and that kind of thing. But the problem is with that is that they allow for open access, and once we put it up there, we can never take it back. So I think that there's still a long ways to go within what we need to do to be able to support Indigenous knowledge systems and our ways of knowing. I don't know when that's going to happen. Like I say, I've been waiting now for 15 years since I did my master's, and I don't know why, but I just thought everything was possible back then. Now I'm at the place where I'm really hoping it happens maybe one day, and hopefully before we lose more elders, because there is this reluctance. In my community, there's many elders that won't even allow themselves to be taped because that knowledge has been taken from them and used against them sometimes, or been abused and not used appropriately. And we don't want to cause harm to people, but we want to be able to share what we know. So I don't have the answers to that, but I do know that part of that is in our protocols, and how we work with the access levels.
Do you have a question, Suzanne?
All right. Oh my God, I'm so loud. My question is about disintegration. I think I mentioned it earlier in the workshop, but I'm Lakota, and I know all about the wannabe tribe. And you know, just yeah, it's the. I was the only one who laughed. You know, I often think about the. You know, okay, so the Lakota are big gift givers, like the whole society, big gift, gift, gift. And the whole point of a gift is that you get it back, you get something in return later. It's reciprocal, it's maybe not right now, but maybe 10 years down the line, you get a gift back, a better gift then even. So, you know, I often think about our objects that are meant to be given as gifts, and then eventually they're recycled or they disintegrate, or you know. And I think about that in terms of net art as well, and internet communities that have come and gone. And the question is, so in certain cases, do we allow them to disintegrate, or is it okay? And then I guess I'm wondering if there are examples in archival practices that allow for this, or where an artist has specified that they'd like it to disappear, like what kind of protection, I don't know. Are there, I guess, Dragan, I'm kind of asking if you have an experience, like if any net art is being allowed to
disintegrate?
Yeah, if that makes any sense.
I think this has been I don't know, how this is called, so something where you explain something to yourself. How is this called? Justification? Sorry. A justification, especially in the early days, in very formative years of media art and digital art and net art, that things just go away. And it was sometimes the metaphor of, decay was used, or mold, or like the forces of nature or physical. And I think this is, I don't think that any artist who wants to have a career as an artist is interested in that, because it's very hard to build a career on this. You can just, in the end, say, okay, it was meant to go away, and this is how you kind of own it. But if there is an option, I've seen in many cases that if an option was presented to the artist, like you did a social media performance and they're saying, yeah, well, you know, I know this is just for right now and tomorrow it's gone, then giving them the option to preserve it, they suddenly see it very differently, because that's just a new option for them. Of course, there is lots of art that is also pretty clever, that deletes itself, or that plays with these ideas of digital permanence. But what I want to, we're talking
Sonic
about
impermanence.
Talking about decay here with the batteries. But I think there is what I see as kind of dangerous about decay in the digital, or it's never decaying away, it's decaying into something. And that is like a sediment where the sediment is kind of taken away from those who let it decay. Because when you see the communities that existed before social media, for example, they were basically the template for a now totally industrialized internet. If you wanted every social media company that came along and was basically building on what was happened before online, what people organized themselves. And these communities disappeared because something more efficient or something better came along, which was actually like de-skilling them for how to make your own community. So because it now exists as a service and it connects you automatically because, I don't know, this person watched the same movie as you or so, which is something very different than actually having a community. Mm-hmm. So I think I think that's in many ways preservation of a community, even one that is kind of not really functioning, where I say, haha, you are still using that, why why are you even doing that? This can also be a very powerful resistance against this de-skilling. I wouldn't want to necessarily connect this to how indigenous knowledge is kind of taken away and abused, basically. But there's definitely that aspect to it, that basically everything that you do and that suddenly is done for you automatically. This is a service, maybe, but it's also, you can also say, I'm letting go of this, but you are also then basically handing over your ability to do stuff and your power. So we have time for one more question. Everybody has it. Wants the microphone? No. Well, what I wanted to see if there's any last words. I know you guys have been on for the whole afternoon, but just see if there's any last things that you guys wanted to say before we wrap up the afternoon.
Thank you.
Saving the microphone.
Thank you. No, thank you. The questions have been great. The hallway conversations have been great. And I know as I'm thinking about kind of returning to this project, I'm taking a lot back. And that's also been from just the questions or seeing where everybody else is at. So, yeah, I feel a lot better. I'm not quite so overwhelmed with all my boxes and piles of stuff.
Excellent.
Oh, but that was just on maybe you first.
Well, I just wanted to say as well, adieu for this opportunity and for everyone being here. And I've really enjoyed listening to the other keynotes speak, and I've learned a lot from them. But I think that the one thing that I have a takeaway from today is I feel really encouraged that there's so many people doing such good work, trying to be able to figure out the questions, and they're great questions. And I believe that we need to work together to find those answers on how we're going to be able to preserve our knowledge as Indigenous people. And I really think that that's part of where we're headed towards, is that it's going to take a community to be able to answer these questions that we're looking at today, and that we need people from each kind of area. So whether we need technical people or people from archives or people that have worked in film, it's going to take all of our resources and our skills and knowledge to come together to be able to answer this. So I'm really encouraged by being here today, and thank you very much for your time and attention and staying when I'm sure you're all getting a little hungry.